The distant wail of horses tearing through the quiet Montana night was the first warning Grace Zimmerman had that danger was approaching her small homestead. It was 1878, and the untamed wilderness of the American frontier had carved her into someone stronger than she ever thought possible, but nothing could have prepared her for what this night would bring. Grace had been tending to her small herb garden at dusk when she first heard the thunderous approach of hooves pounding against hard, packed earth. She straightened, pushing back wisps of auburn hair that had escaped her practical braid, and squinted into the darkening horizon. The sunset painted the sky in fierce oranges and reds, an ominous backdrop to the dust cloud rising from the direction of White Rock Pass. At 24, Grace had lived alone in her cabin for nearly 2 years since her father's passing. The small plot of land with its modest cabin and struggling vegetable garden wasn't much, but it was everything she had. Neighbors were sparse in this part of Montana territory, the closest being old Mrs. Henley 3 miles east and the newly established Callaway Ranch about 5 miles to the north. The sound grew louder. Grace dropped her gardening tools and hurried inside, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd heard rumors of the Blackwater Gang moving through the territory, ruthless outlaws who'd robbed the Missoula Bank last month and killed 2 men in the process. Their leader, Samuel Rain, was said to be as cruel as he was cunning. Inside her cabin, Grace pulled the heavy wooden bar across the door and checked the loading of her father's old rifle. Her hands trembled slightly as she counted the ammunition, just 7 bullets. Not nearly enough if it was indeed the Blackwater Gang approaching. "Lord, please let it be someone just passing through," she whispered, peering through the small window beside the door. The riders materialized from the shadows, 6 men on horseback, their faces obscured by bandanas pulled high. They slowed as they approached her cabin, and Grace's blood ran cold when she saw the telltale black hat with a silver band that Samuel Rain was known to wear. "Well, well," a booming voice called out. "Looks like we found ourselves a little homestead, boys." The men dismounted, laughing and jeering. One kicked at her garden, deliberately crushing the vegetables she'd tended so carefully. Another approached the small stable where her mare Penny nickered nervously. "Please," Grace called through the door, trying to keep her voice steady. "I don't have anything of value here. I'm just a woman living alone." "Open up, lady," came the reply. "We've had a long ride and we're mighty hungry. The least you could do is offer some hospitality to weary travelers." Grace gripped the rifle tighter. "I can set some food outside the door, but I'm not opening it." This was met with harsh laughter. "Hear that, Samuel? The little lady thinks she has a choice in the matter." The leader, Rain, stepped closer to the door. "We heard tell that old man Zimmerman had himself a stash of gold before he died. His darling daughter would know where it's hidden, wouldn't she?" A chill ran through Grace. The rumor of her father's gold had persisted for years, despite her efforts to quash it. There had never been any gold, just a lifetime of hard work and modest living, but the tale had grown with each telling in the saloons and trading posts throughout the territory. "That's just a rumor," she called back. "My father was a poor man. We never had anything but what you see." "Search the stable," Rain ordered one of his men. "Jackson, Thompson, check the perimeter. There's gotta be a cellar or a hidey hole somewhere." Grace heard them rummaging through her property, destroying what little she had built. Tears of anger formed in her eyes, but she blinked them away. This was no time for weakness. After several minutes, one of the men returned to Rain. "Nothing in the stable or the storage shed, boss. Just a skinny mare and some farming tools." Rain's voice turned cold. "She's lying. The gold's in the cabin." "I'm telling you the truth," Grace insisted. "There is no gold. Break down the door," Rain commanded. Grace backed away, raising the rifle as the first thud hit the door. The wooden bar held, but she knew it wouldn't last long against determined men. She glanced around desperately, looking for an escape route. The small window in the back room might be her only chance. Another powerful kick shook the door. The wood splintered around the hinges. Abandoning the rifle, it would only slow her down. Grace grabbed her father's pocket watch from the mantel, the only keepsake she couldn't bear to leave, and ran for the back room. She had just pushed open the window when she heard the front door crash inward. "Find her," Rain bellowed. Grace squeezed through the window, scraping her arms on the rough wood. She landed hard on the ground outside and took off running toward the tree line. Behind her, angry shouts erupted from the cabin. "She's out back. Get her!" Gunshots cracked through the night. Dirt kicked up near Grace's feet as bullets narrowly missed her. She zigzagged, making herself a harder target as she ran for the cover of the trees. Her lungs burned and her legs felt leaden, but fear propelled her forward. She had almost reached the trees when a searing pain shot through her left arm. The impact knocked her off balance, sending her tumbling to the ground. A bullet had grazed her, cutting a hot path through her flesh. She bit back a cry of pain and forced herself back to her feet, clutching her bleeding arm. The woods offered temporary sanctuary. Grace pushed deeper into the forest, using the darkness and her knowledge of the terrain to her advantage. Behind her, she could hear the outlaws crashing through the underbrush, their curses echoing through the trees. She didn't know how long she ran. Time seemed suspended in the grip of terror. Eventually, the sounds of pursuit faded and Grace slowed, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She leaned against a large pine, trying to catch her breath and assess her wound. The bullet had only grazed her, but it was bleeding freely, and the pain throbbed with each heartbeat. Using strips torn from her petticoat, she bound the wound as best she could. Then, moving carefully to avoid leaving an obvious trail, she circled back toward her cabin. She needed to know what was happening, whether the outlaws had left or were still searching for her. The smell reached her before she could see through the trees' smoke, thick and acrid. As she drew closer, the orange glow of flames illuminated the night sky. Horror clutched at her heart. They had set fire to her home. From the cover of the trees, Grace watched as her cabin burned, flames licking hungrily at the dry timber. The outlaws were gathered in front, passing a bottle between them and laughing as her life's work turned to ash. Penny, her faithful mare, was nowhere to be seen, either stolen or set free. Tears streamed down Grace's face as she watched everything she owned being consumed by fire. The small collection of books that had been her mother's, the quilt her grandmother had made, the rocking chair where her father had told her stories on winter evenings, all of it gone. "Let's ride, boys," Rain called out, mounting his horse. "If she wants to hide in the woods, let her. She can freeze come winter with no roof over her head." The outlaws mounted up, still laughing and jeering. As they rode off, one fired a parting shot into what remained of her garden. When they had disappeared into the darkness, Grace emerged from her hiding place, drawn to the blazing ruins of her home like a moth to flame. The heat was intense, forcing her to keep her distance as she circled the burning structure. Nothing could be saved. 24 years of memories reduced to embers in a matter of minutes. She sank to her knees in the dirt, her injured arm throbbing and her heart shattered. The sobs came then, deep and wrenching, torn from the very core of her being. She had survived, but for what? Everything that had anchored her to this place was gone. Grace didn't know how long she knelt there, weeping as the flames consumed her home. She was vaguely aware of the cold seeping into her bones, of the blood drying on her arm, of the dangerous exposure of being alone in the open with night predators about. But despair had claimed her, leaving no room for caution or self-preservation. The sound of approaching hoofbeats barely registered through her grief. Perhaps the outlaws had returned to finish what they'd started. In that moment, Grace wasn't sure she cared, but it wasn't the Blackwater Gang. A lone rider appeared from the northern trail, silhouetted against the night sky. As he drew closer, the firelight revealed a tall man with a weathered face, his expression shifting from curiosity to alarm as he took in the burning cabin and the woman kneeling before it. Nathan Irwin had been riding back to the Cowboy ranch after delivering a message to the marshal in White Rock when he spotted the fire. At 32, he'd seen his share of hardship and violence in the decade since the war ended, but the sight of a solitary woman crying before a burning homestead still managed to shake him. Without hesitation, Nathan spurred his horse forward. The structure was fully engulfed, and he doubted anyone could be inside and still alive, but he had to be sure. Heat blasted his face as he rode closer, his horse snorting and shying away from the flames. "Anyone inside?" he shouted to the woman. She looked up, her tear-stained face illuminated by the fire. She shook her head mutely. Nathan's gaze swept the area, looking for signs of whoever had done this. Fresh hoofprints led away to the east, at least 5 or 6 riders. His jaw tightened. Bandits, most likely. He dismounted and approached the woman carefully, not wanting to startle her further. As he got closer, he could see she was injured. Blood stained the makeshift bandage on her arm. "Madam, it's not safe here," he said, keeping his voice gentle despite having to raise it over the roar of the fire. "Those men might come back." She stared at him, her green eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "It's all gone," she whispered. "Everything?" Nathan knelt beside her, noting the quality of her homespun dress and the calluses on her hands. A hard-working woman, not some Eastern transplant playing at frontier life. "I'm Nathan Irwin, ranch foreman at Calloway's place to the north," he introduced himself. "Let me help you." The fire popped and crackled as a section of the roof collapsed inward, sending a shower of sparks into the night sky. The woman flinched at the sound. "Grace," she said after a moment. "Grace Zimmerman." Recognition flickered in Nathan's eyes. "Old Tom Zimmerman's daughter." "I met your pa once or twice at the general store." Grace nodded, a fresh wave of grief washing over her features. "He built this cabin with his own hands. It was all I had left of him." Nathan glanced at her injured arm. "You're hurt, and it's not safe to stay here. Those riders might circle back, or the fire could spread to the woods." He paused, considering their limited options. "I can take you to Calloway's. Mrs. Calloway will tend to that wound, and you'll have a safe place to stay tonight." Grace seemed to come back to herself somewhat, suddenly aware of her vulnerable position. "The Blackwater Gang," she said. "That's who did this. They were looking for gold that never existed." Nathan's expression hardened. Samuel Rain and his men had been terrorizing the territory for months. The marshal had organized a posse twice, but the gang always seemed to vanish into the wilderness before they could be caught. "All the more reason to get you somewhere safe," he said, standing and offering his hand. "Can you ride?" Grace hesitated, then placed her hand in his. It was small but strong, a working woman's hand. "Yes, but they took or freed my mare." "You'll ride with me then." Nathan helped her to her feet. She swayed slightly, and he steadied her with a hand on her elbow. "Easy now." The heat from the fire was becoming unbearable as more of the structure collapsed. Nathan guided Grace to his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Scout. "Let me help you up," he said, interlacing his fingers to create a stirrup for her foot. Grace placed her boot in his hands and grabbed the saddle horn, allowing him to boost her up. Despite her injured arm, she moved with the practiced ease of someone who had been riding since childhood. Nathan swung up behind her, careful to give her space while still ensuring she wouldn't fall. "Hold on," he instructed, reaching around her to take the reins. As they rode away, Grace couldn't help looking back at the burning ruins of her home. The flames had begun to die down, leaving only the blackened skeleton of what had once been her entire world. Fresh tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. Crying wouldn't rebuild her home or restore what she had lost. They rode in silence for a time, the steady rhythm of Scout's hooves the only sound besides the occasional night creature. The moon had risen, casting silvery light across the rugged landscape. In the distance, an owl hooted, its melancholy call seeming to echo Grace's loss. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice barely audible above the sound of their travel, "for stopping." Nathan nodded, though she couldn't see the gesture from her position. Any decent man would have done the same. "There aren't as many decent men in these parts as you might think," Grace replied, a bitter edge to her voice. "Those outlaws, they enjoyed destroying everything I had." Laughed while they did it. Nathan's jaw tightened. He'd seen that kind of cruelty during the war and afterward, men who took pleasure in others' suffering. It was a poison that seemed to spread in the lawless expanses of the frontier. "The marshal will want to hear about this," he said. "Rain and his gang have hit 3 homesteads this month alone." "What good will that do?" Grace asked, fatigue and despair evident in her voice. The marshal hasn't been able to catch them yet, and it won't bring back my home. Nathan had no answer for that. She was right, the local law was spread thin across too much territory, and outlaws like the Blackwater Gang knew how to exploit that weakness. They crested a low hill, and the Cowboy ranch came into view in the valley below. Lamplight glowed in the windows of the main house, a two-story structure built of sturdy logs with a stone chimney. Several smaller buildings surrounded it: bunkhouse, barn, smokehouse, and a corral where horses moved like shadows in the moonlight. "Almost there," Nathan said. "The Calloways are good people, they'll help you." Grace nodded, but dread filled her stomach. She had always been fiercely independent like her father before her. The thought of being dependent on the charity of strangers, no matter how well-intentioned, made her feel hollow inside. As they approached the ranch, a dog began to bark, alerting the household to their arrival. The front door opened, spilling golden lamplight onto the porch, and a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out, rifle in hand. "Who goes there?" he called. "It's Nathan, Mr. Calloway," Nathan answered. "I've got someone who needs help." They drew closer, and James Calloway lowered his rifle, recognition dawning on his weathered face. He was in his 50s, with iron-gray hair and the solid build of a man who had spent his life working the land. "Nathan, wasn't expecting you back tonight." His gaze shifted to Grace, noting her disheveled appearance and the blood-stained bandage on her arm. "What happened?" "Blackwater Gang," Nathan replied grimly as he dismounted and helped Grace down from Scout. "They burned Miss Zimmerman's cabin to the ground. She's injured." James Calloway's expression darkened. "Tom Zimmerman's girl, those bastards." He turned toward the house and called, "Martha, come quick." A plump woman with kind eyes appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. When she saw Grace, she rushed forward. "Oh, you poor dear." Come inside, come inside. James, fetch my medical box. Nathan, stable your horse and then come in for supper, it's still warm." Before Grace could protest, Martha Calloway had an arm around her shoulders and was guiding her toward the house. The older woman's maternal efficiency was oddly comforting after the chaos of the night. Inside, the ranch house was warm and welcoming, with handmade furniture and colorful quilts that spoke of a woman's touch. A large fireplace dominated one wall of the main room, and the scent of beef stew lingered in the air, making Grace suddenly aware of how hungry she was. "Sit down, child," Martha instructed, leading Grace to a chair at the large wooden table. "Let me look at that arm." Grace allowed the older woman to unwrap the crude bandage. Martha tutted at the sight of the bullet graze. "Those animals," she muttered. "Shooting at a woman, what is this world coming to?" She glanced up as her husband entered with a wooden box. "James, fetch the whiskey, this will need cleaning." As Martha tended to her wound, Grace found herself telling the Calloways about the attack, how the outlaws had come looking for non-existent gold, how she had fled into the woods, and how they had burned her home in retribution. "You're lucky to be alive," James said solemnly, pouring her a small glass of whiskey. "Drink this, it'll help with the pain." Grace took a sip, grimacing at the burn. "I don't feel lucky. Everything I owned was in that cabin." Martha finished bandaging the wound and patted Grace's good arm. "What matters is that you're safe. Things can be replaced, people can't." The front door opened and Nathan stepped inside. He had removed his hat, revealing thick brown hair that curled slightly at the ends. There was trail dust on his clothes, but he had clearly made an effort to wash up before coming inside. "How is she?" he asked, his gaze finding Grace immediately. "She'll be fine," Martha answered. "The bullet just grazed her. Sit and eat, both of you. Food helps everything." Nathan took a seat across from Grace as Martha bustled about, setting bowls of stew and slices of bread before them. Grace hadn't realized how hungry she was until the food was in front of her. She ate slowly at first, then with increasing appetite as her body demanded nourishment after the trauma. "I sent one of the hands to ride to town," James informed them as they ate. "Marshal Thompson should know about the Blackwater Gang being in the area. He might be able to organize a posse while their trail is still fresh." "They were headed east when they left," Grace supplied. "At least 6 of them, including Samuel Rain. I recognized him from descriptions I've heard." James nodded grimly. Bold as brass, that one, getting more dangerous by the month. Miss Zimmerman can stay here until she decides what to do next, Martha declared, brooking no argument. The guest room is made up and I have some clothes that might fit you, dear. Grace set down her spoon, emotion welling up in her throat. I can't impose nonsense, Martha interrupted. It's not imposing when it's offered freely. Besides, it's what neighbors do out here, we help each other. Grace looked around the table at these people who had taken her in without question, Martha with her maternal concern, James with his quiet strength, and Nathan, whose eyes held a gentle understanding that somehow eased the ache in her heart. Thank you, she said simply. I don't know what I would have done. You don't need to think about that, Nathan said quietly. You're safe now, that's what matters. Later, after Grace had been shown to the guest room and provided with a nightgown and fresh clothes for the morning, she stood by the window, looking out at the moonlit landscape. Somewhere out there were the smoldering remains of her home and the shattered pieces of the life she had built. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Come in, she called. Martha entered, carrying a steaming cup. Chamomile tea, she explained, to help you sleep. God knows you need it after what you've been through. Grace accepted the cup gratefully. I can't thank you enough, Mrs. Calloway. Martha, please. The older woman sat on the edge of the bed. I wanted to tell you Nathan explained how he found you. That young man has a good heart. Been working for us for nearly 3 years now, and I've never known him to turn away from someone in need. He rode through the flames, Grace said softly, remembering how he had appeared like some avenging angel silhouetted against the burning ruins of her home. He could have just ridden on, most would have. Martha smiled knowingly, not Nathan. He's had his share of hardship, fought in the war, lost his family to fever some years back. He understands what it means to need a helping hand. She paused, studying Grace's face. You're welcome to stay as long as you need, you know. This territory is hard enough on menfolk, it's twice as hard on a woman alone. Grace sipped the tea, letting the warm, floral scent soothe her. I've been alone since Pa died, I managed. And you'll manage again, Martha assured her, but there's no shame in accepting help along the way. She stood, patting Grace's hand. Try to get some sleep. Things often look brighter in the morning light. After Martha left, Grace finished her tea and crawled into the unfamiliar bed. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the flames consuming her cabin, heard the cruel laughter of the outlaws. She wondered what would become of her now, with no home, no possessions, and winter just a few months away. Eventually, the chamomile tea and sheer exhaustion won out, and Grace drifted into a fitful sleep. Her dreams were a chaotic blend of fire and fear, punctuated by the image of a tall cowboy riding through flames to reach her. She awoke to sunlight streaming through the window and the distant sounds of a working ranch men calling to each other, livestock lowing, the rhythmic chunk of an axe splitting wood. For a moment, Grace was disoriented, the unfamiliar room adding to her confusion. Then the events of the previous night came rushing back, bringing with them a fresh wave of grief. A dress had been laid out for her, simple but well-made, in a faded blue that was a far cry from her usual practical browns and grays. Her own clothes had been taken away, presumably to be washed of the blood and dirt. Grace dressed slowly, her injured arm protesting every movement. Her hair was a tangled mess, but someone had thoughtfully left a brush on the dresser. When she eventually made her way downstairs, she found Martha in the kitchen, kneading bread dough with practiced hands. "Good morning, dear," the older woman greeted her. "I was beginning to think you might sleep the day away, not that anyone would blame you after what you've been through." "What time is it?" Grace asked, embarrassed at the thought of sleeping late while others worked. "Just past 9. There's coffee on the stove and I can fix you some eggs if you're hungry." "Please, don't trouble yourself," Grace protested. "I can help." Martha waved a flour-covered hand. "You'll do no such thing, not with that arm. Sit and have some coffee. The men have already eaten and gone about their business." Grace reluctantly took a seat at the kitchen table, accepting the cup of coffee Martha poured for her. It was rich and strong, better than the chicory-stretched brew she usually made at home. "Marshall Thompson rode in about an hour ago," Martha informed her as she returned to her bread making. "He's out with James and Nathan now, talking about those outlaws." As if summoned by her words, the back door opened and the three men entered the kitchen. Nathan was the first to spot Grace, and his face brightened with a smile that made her heart skip strangely. "Miss Zimmerman," he said, "how are you feeling this morning?" Before she could answer, the marshal stepped forward. Grace recognized Hank Thompson from her infrequent trips to town, a tall, lean man with a graying mustache and tired eyes that had seen too much frontier justice. "Miss Zimmerman," the marshal greeted her, removing his hat. "I'm mighty sorry about what happened to your place. Mr. Irwin here filled me in on most of it, but I was hoping you could tell me anything else you remember about the Outlaws." Grace recounted the events of the previous night in as much detail as she could, describing each of the men she had seen clearly enough to remember. The marshal listened intently, occasionally jotting notes in a small book. "That matches what we know about the Blackwater Gang," he confirmed when she had finished. "I've got men tracking them, but I won't lie to you, they're good at disappearing into the territory." "What about my property?" Grace asked. Is there anything left?" James and Nathan exchanged a look that made her stomach sink. "I rode out at first light to check," Nathan said gently. "The cabin's gone, I'm afraid, just ashes and the stone chimney standing. I found your mare, though she was grazing about a half-mile away, brought her back here." Relief washed through Grace at this small mercy. "Penny's alive, thank God for that at least. We found some tracks around what's left of your place," the marshal added. "Looks like they circled back after Mr. Irwin brought you here, probably making sure the fire did its work." The thought of the outlaws returning, gloating over the destruction they had caused, made Grace's blood run cold. She clutched her coffee cup tighter. "What will you do now, Miss Zimmerman?" Marshal Thompson asked. It was the question Grace had been avoiding since waking. What could she do? She had no home, no money to speak of, and winter approaching. The obvious answer the one most women in her position would choose would be to return to St. Louis, where her mother's sister lived. But the thought of leaving Montana, of admitting defeat and retreating to a city she barely remembered, felt like another kind of death. "I don't know," she admitted. "I have the land still, but no means to rebuild before winter." "You'll stay here until you figure it out," Martha declared, hands on her hips in a pose that brooked no argument. "We've plenty of room, and an extra pair of hands is always welcome on a ranch this size." James nodded in agreement. Martha's right, no need to make hasty decisions. The marshal replaced his hat. "I'll let you know if we catch up to Rain and his men. In the meantime, you're in good hands with the Calloways." He tipped his hat to Martha. "Madam, thank you for the coffee." After the marshal departed, an awkward silence fell over the kitchen. Grace felt the weight of the Calloways' generosity pressing down on her, along with the uncertainty of her future. "I should check on Penny," she said, rising from her chair. "I'll show you to the stable," Nathan offered. "I want to make sure Scout didn't strain a fetlock last night. He's not used to carrying double." Outside, the October sun cast long shadows across the ranch yard. The air had a crispness to it that hinted at the winter to come. Nathan walked beside Grace, matching his longer stride to her more measured pace. "The Calloways mean what they say," he told her. "They're good people, you can stay as long as you need." "I can't impose indefinitely," Grace replied. "I need to figure out what comes next." She glanced sideways at him. "What about you? How did you come to work for them?" Nathan's expression softened with memory. "After the war, I drifted for a while, did some cowboying in Texas, some mining in Colorado. Nothing stuck. I was passing through these parts 3 years back when a blizzard hit. James found me half frozen on the trail and brought me here." He shrugged. "By spring, I'd made myself useful enough that they offered me the foreman position. Been here ever since." "You found a home," Grace observed. "Of a sort," he agreed. "Though it's not the same as having your own place. I understand what you lost last night, Miss Zimmerman." They reached the stable, a well-built structure that housed a dozen horses. Nathan led her to a stall where Penny, her chestnut mare, whickered in greeting. Grace reached out to stroke the horse's velvety nose, fighting back tears of relief. "Hello, old friend," she murmured. "I'm glad you're safe." Nathan leaned against the stall door, watching the reunion. "She's a fine animal, came right to me when I called this morning, like she knew I was there to help." "She's all I have left now," Grace said, the reality of her situation hitting her anew. "Everything else is gone." "Not everything," Nathan said quietly. "You're alive, you have your health mostly." He gestured to her bandaged arm with a small smile. "And you have your land, that's more than some start with." Grace looked up at him, struck by the quiet confidence in his voice. There was something steadying about Nathan Irwin, like a rock in a rushing stream. "I suppose you're right," she acknowledged, "but rebuilding takes money and I don't have much saved." Nathan hesitated, then said, "There might be a way." "The lumber mill in White Rock sometimes hires women for the office work. And Mrs. Calloway mentioned last week that she's been wanting someone to help with her preserving and sowing before winter sets in. She's got arthritis in her hands, something fierce, though she tries to hide it." "You're suggesting I work for the Calloways?" Grace asked, not entirely sure how to feel about the idea. "For now," Nathan nodded. "Save what you can. By spring, you might have enough to start rebuilding." It wasn't an ideal solution, but it was practical. And the thought of having a purpose, of working toward rebuilding rather than simply accepting charity, eased some of the tension in Grace's shoulders. "I'll speak to Martha about it," she decided. "Thank you for the suggestion." Nathan smiled, and Grace found herself noticing how the expression transformed his serious face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. He was handsome in a rugged way, with a straight nose and a strong jaw shadowed with stubble. Not that his looks mattered, she was simply making an observation. "You're welcome, Miss Zimmerman," he replied. "For what it's worth, I think you're stronger than you know. You'll rebuild, and in the meantime, you're not alone." The sincerity in his voice touched something deep within Grace, a place that had been frozen since her father's death. For the first time since the attack, she felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps with time and hard work, she could create a new life from the ashes of the old one. Over the days that followed, Grace settled into a rhythm at the Calloway Ranch. Martha gratefully accepted her offer of help, and Grace found herself busy with preserving the last of the garden harvest, mending clothes, and assisting with the endless tasks that kept a large ranch household running. James insisted on paying her a modest wage, despite her protests that room and board was payment enough. Nathan was often away during the days, overseeing the ranch hands as they prepared the herd for winter and repaired fences and outbuildings. But in the evenings, he would join the family for dinner, and Grace found herself looking forward to these times. Nathan was quiet by nature, but when he did speak, his observations were thoughtful and often laced with a dry humor that made her smile. A week after the attack, Marshal Thompson returned with news. The posse had tracked the Blackwater Gang as far as the territorial border but lost their trail in the rugged country beyond. There was nothing to do but remain vigilant and hope the Outlaws had moved on to easier targets. The news was disappointing but not unexpected. Grace had already begun to accept that justice might never be served for the destruction of her home. Instead, she focused on the future, riding out with Nathan one clear morning to survey what remained of her property. The sight of the burned-out cabin was a shock despite her mental preparation. Only the stone chimney still stood, a stark monument to what had been lost. The garden was trampled, the small stable partially collapsed. Yet the land itself remained 20 acres of good Montana soil that had been her father's pride. "It looks worse than I remembered," Grace said, dismounting carefully. Her arm was healing well, but it still pained her if she moved too quickly. Nathan tied their horses to what remained of the garden fence and joined her as she walked among the ruins. "Fire has a way of doing that," he agreed, "but the foundation is still sound, and the well wasn't damaged." Grace knelt and sifted the ashes through her fingers. Beneath the char, she found a small metal object, her mother's thimble, blackened but intact. She closed her hand around it, feeling as though she had recovered a small piece of her heart. "I'm going to rebuild," she declared, looking up at Nathan. "Not right away, it's too close to winter." "But in the spring," Nathan nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "I thought you might say that. The Calloways will help, so will I." Grace stood, tucking the thimble into her pocket. Why would you do that? You hardly know me. I know enough, Nathan replied simply. I know you're brave and determined. I know you love this land. And I know what it's like to lose everything and have to start over. There was something in the way he looked at her then, something that made Grace's breath catch. But the moment passed as Nathan turned to survey the property with a practical eye. The timber on the north side of your land could provide most of what you'd need for the cabin itself, he observed. With a good axe and some help, we could have the logs cut and cured by spring. Grace echoed. Nathan looked slightly embarrassed. I mean, if you'd accept the help, I'm handy with an axe and I helped build the new bunkhouse at Calloway's last year. The offer touched Grace deeply. I would be grateful for any help, she said softly, but I don't expect it. That's the beauty of it, Nathan replied with a small smile. The best kind of help is the kind that's freely given, not expected. They spent the next hour walking the property, with Nathan pointing out the best spots for timber and suggesting improvements to the cabin design that would make it more weather-resistant. Grace found herself impressed by his practical knowledge and the easy way he shared it without making her feel ignorant. As they prepared to ride back to the Calloway Ranch, Grace took one last look at the ruins of her old life. The grief was still there, but it was tempered now by determination and a fragile hope. It won't be the same, she said, more to herself than to Nathan. No, he agreed, understanding in his voice, but sometimes what we build after loss is stronger than what we had before. Grace pondered his words during the ride back, finding wisdom in them that resonated with her own experience. She had been surviving since her father's death, going through the motions of life without truly living it. Perhaps this forced new beginning was an opportunity as well as a tragedy. The weeks passed, and autumn deepened toward winter. The first snow dusted the mountains in early November, a gentle warning of the harsher weather to come. Grace continued to work for the Calloways, saving every penny toward rebuilding her cabin. She also took Nathan's suggestion and secured part-time work at the lumber mill in Whiterock, riding in twice a week to help with the bookkeeping. Her relationship with Nathan evolved during this time, moving from gratitude to friendship with an ease that surprised her. They were different in many ways. He was reserved where she was outspoken, cautious where she was impulsive. Yet they shared a common understanding of loss and resilience that created a bond between them. One evening in late November, Grace was sitting on the Calloway's porch, wrapped in a warm shawl despite the cold. The first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, and the snow-capped mountains glowed pink with the last light of sunset. Nathan found her there, returning from checking on a pregnant mare in the barn. "You'll catch your death out here," he chided gently, but he sat down beside her on the porch swing. "It's worth it for the view," Grace replied. "I've always loved the mountains at this time of day." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching as the pink faded from the peaks and the stars grew brighter in the deepening blue of the sky. "I spoke with James today," Nathan said finally, "about taking some time in the spring to help with your cabin." Grace turned to look at him, surprised, and, he said he was planning to suggest it himself, said the whole ranch would pitch in. "It's the way things are done out here." Warmth that had nothing to do with her shawl spread through Grace's chest. "That's incredibly generous." "It's practical as much as generous," Nathan pointed out. "Folks help their neighbors because someday they might need help themselves. It's how we all survive out here." "Still," Grace insisted, "I'm grateful, to you especially." Nathan looked slightly uncomfortable with her gratitude, as he often did. "I haven't done anything special." "You rode through fire to find me," Grace said softly. "You could have kept riding, most would have." The porch swing creaked gently as Nathan shifted. "I couldn't ride past someone in trouble, especially not," he broke off, seeming to reconsider his words. "Especially not what?" Grace prompted. "Especially not a woman alone," he finished, though Grace suspected that wasn't what he had been about to say. "It's a hard country for anyone, but doubly so for a woman trying to make her way without family." Grace bristled slightly at this. "I was managing just fine before the Blackwater Gang came along. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise," Nathan said quickly. "I admire how independent you are." It's just that even the strongest person needs help sometimes. The tension eased from Grace's shoulders. I suppose you're right. It's hard for me to accept help. Pa always said a Zimmerman pays their own way. A good principle, Nathan agreed, but not one that accounts for outlaws burning down your home. Despite the grim topic, Grace found herself smiling at his dry delivery. No, I suppose not. They fell silent again, watching as the last light faded from the sky and the stars emerged in full splendor. The air grew colder and Grace shivered despite her shawl. We should go in, Nathan suggested, rising and offering his hand. Grace took it, noticing as she had before how rough his palm was from years of ranch work, yet how gentle his grip could be. Something fluttered in her stomach at the contact, a feeling she wasn't quite ready to examine too closely. As winter settled over Montana territory, life at the Cowboy ranch fell into a comfortable pattern. The heavy snows made travel difficult, limiting Grace's trips to the lumber mill. Instead, she threw herself into helping Martha with household tasks and learning everything she could about managing a ranch. If she was to rebuild her life come spring, she would need every bit of knowledge she could gather. Nathan was busy with winter ranch work, feeding livestock, breaking ice on water troughs, and repairing equipment in the barn. But he made time each evening to sit with Grace and draw plans for her new cabin, suggesting improvements and listening to her ideas with genuine interest. Christmas came, bringing with it a festive atmosphere despite the isolation of the ranch. Martha decorated the house with pine boughs and ribbons, and the men brought in a small tree that was set up in the corner of the main room. Grace helped bake cookies and pies, feeling a bittersweet nostalgia for the simple Christmases she had shared with her father on Christmas Eve. After a hearty dinner that brought together the Calloways, their ranch hands and Grace gifts were exchanged around the fire. Grace had little to give, but she had spent evenings embroidering handkerchiefs for Martha, carving a pipe for James from a piece of good hardwood, and knitting a warm scarf for Nathan. When Nathan opened his gift, his expression of surprise and pleasure made all the hours of work worthwhile. "This is beautiful," he said, running his fingers over the intricate pattern she had worked into the dark blue wool. "Thank you, Grace." It was the first time he had used her given name instead of Miss Zimmerman, and the intimacy of it sent a pleasant warmth through her. "You're welcome," she replied. "I noticed your old one was rather threadbare." "I have something for you too," Nathan said, reaching into his pocket and producing a small package wrapped in brown paper. "It's not much, but—" Grace unwrapped the gift carefully. Inside was a small wooden carving of a cabin, complete with tiny details like a rocking chair on the porch and smoke curling from the chimney. It was clearly the cabin from the plans they had drawn together, rendered with surprising skill. "You made this?" she asked, turning it over in her hands to admire the craftsmanship. Nathan nodded, looking slightly embarrassed. "I whittle a bit, picked it up during long watches in the war. It's perfect," Grace said softly. "Thank you, Nathan." Their eyes met over the carving, and something passed between them, something new and fragile that made Grace's heart beat faster. The moment was broken when one of the ranch hands started playing a fiddle, calling everyone to join in singing carols. The evening passed in song and laughter, a bright spot in the long winter. Later, as Grace lay in bed listening to the wind howling outside her window, she found herself thinking of Nathan, of his quiet strength, his kindness, and the way he looked at her when he thought she wouldn't notice. It was dangerous territory. Grace had always prided herself on her independence, on not needing anyone. The idea of caring for someone, of possibly being hurt if those feelings weren't returned, it terrified her almost as much as it intrigued her. Better to focus on rebuilding her home and her life. Romance was a luxury she couldn't afford right now, but as she drifted off to sleep, it was Nathan's smile she saw behind her closed eyelids. January brought the harshest weather of the winter, bitter cold and snowstorms that isolated the ranch for days at a time. The work never ceased, however. Livestock needed tending regardless of the weather, and there were always indoor tasks to keep everyone busy during the long, dark days. Grace found herself working alongside Nathan more frequently, as Martha's arthritis worsened in the cold. They developed an easy rhythm together, whether they were mucking out stalls, mending tack, or sorting supplies in the storeroom. Conversation between them flowed naturally, covering everything from childhood memories to hopes for the future. "Did you always want to be a rancher?" Grace asked one afternoon as they worked together in the barn, sorting seed potatoes for spring planting. Nathan considered the question, his hands never stopping their methodical work. "Not always. When I was a boy in Ohio, I wanted to be a riverboat captain." He smiled at the memory. "Seemed glamorous then, traveling up and down the Mississippi." "What changed? Life, I suppose. My father died when I was 15, had to help my mother with the farm." His expression grew more serious. "Then the war came after that. Well, a man takes what opportunities present themselves." Grace nodded, understanding. "Do you ever regret it, not following that dream?" Nathan looked up, meeting her eyes across the pile of potatoes. "No, dreams change as we grow. Now I dream of having my own piece of land someday. Something modest enough for a small herd, a garden. A place to put down roots." There was something in his voice that made Grace wonder if there was more to that dream, perhaps a family to share it with. The thought brought a flush to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the cold. "What about you?" Nathan asked. "Did you always want to be a homesteader?" Grace shook her head. "I wanted to be a teacher, actually. Had my heart set on it as a girl, but then Ma died and Pa decided to head west, said there was nothing left for us in Missouri." She sighed, remembering. "I was angry at first. But I grew to love Montana, the openness of it, the challenge." "You could still teach," Nathan suggested. "White Rock's growing, they'll need a proper school soon enough." The idea was appealing in a way Grace hadn't expected. "Perhaps, but first I need to rebuild my home." "One step at a time," Nathan agreed. "That's the only way to accomplish anything worthwhile." As January gave way to February, the weather began to moderate slightly. The sun returned for longer periods each day, and the worst of the snowstorms seemed to have passed. Grace's spirits lifted with the increasing light, and she threw herself into preparations for spring with renewed energy. One clear morning in late February, Nathan proposed a ride to check on Grace's property. "The snow's packed enough for the horses to manage," he said over breakfast. "It would be good to see if there's been any damage over the winter." Grace agreed eagerly, tired of being confined to the ranch. Martha packed them a simple lunch, and they set out mid-morning under a brilliant blue sky. The landscape was transformed by snow, the familiar contours hidden beneath a white blanket that sparkled in the sunlight. Their horses' breath clouded in the cold air as they picked their way carefully along the trail. "It's beautiful," Grace said, gazing at the snow-covered mountains that rose majestically in the distance. "I sometimes forget how beautiful this country is." Nathan nodded in agreement. "That's what keeps me here despite the hardships. There's nowhere else on earth quite like it." They rode mostly in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When they crested the final hill and Grace's property came into view, she felt a surge of emotion. The charred remains of her cabin were buried under snow, with only the stone chimney rising like a sentinel above the white expanse. Yet the land itself was peaceful, beautiful in its winter slumber. "It looks different in the snow," she observed as they dismounted near where the garden had been. "Everything does," Nathan replied, "cleaner, like a fresh start." They walked the property line, checking for fallen trees or other issues that might need addressing come spring. Nathan pointed out where the new cabin should be positioned slightly higher than the old one, to take advantage of the natural drainage of the land and provide a better view of the valley. "We could start clearing the timber next month if the weather holds," he suggested. "Get a head start on curing the logs." Grace asked, raising an eyebrow. "You have your duties at the ranch." Nathan looked slightly embarrassed. "I spoke with James. He's agreed to let me spend 2 days a week helping you once the spring calving is done." Grace stopped walking, surprised and touched by this gesture. "You arranged that without telling me?" "I didn't want to mention it until I was sure James could spare me," Nathan explained. "If you'd rather hire someone from town—" "No," Grace interrupted. "I'd much rather have your help. I don't want to be a burden." Nathan's expression softened. "You're not a burden, Grace, far from it." He hesitated, then added more quietly, "These past months, getting to know you, they've been the best I've had in a long time." The confession hung in the cold air between them, more significant than its simple words might suggest. Grace felt her heart quicken as she met Nathan's gaze, seeing in his eyes a warmth that had nothing to do with friendship. "I've felt the same," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, it seemed as though Nathan might step closer, might say more, but a sudden gust of wind swirled snow around them, breaking the spell. Nathan cleared his throat and gestured toward a stand of pines on the north edge of the property. Those trees would make good cabin logs. Straight and tall, Grace allowed the moment to pass, not quite ready to confront the feelings growing between them. Yes, they look perfect. They continued their inspection of the property, the conversation returning to practical matters. But something had shifted between them, an acknowledgement of possibilities that hadn't existed before. As winter began to loosen its grip on the land, Grace's anticipation grew. Each day brought them closer to spring, to rebuilding, to the next chapter of her life. She had saved nearly every penny of her wages from the Calloways and the lumber mill, accumulating enough to purchase the supplies she couldn't salvage or make herself. March arrived with milder weather, and the first hints of green appearing beneath the melting snow. Ranch activity increased as preparations for calving season intensified. Grace found herself busier than ever, helping Martha with spring cleaning while still assisting at the lumber mill twice a week. It was during one of her trips to White Rock that Grace first heard the rumors. She was sorting invoices in the mill office when two men entered, talking in low, urgent voices about a stagecoach robbery near Bitter Creek. "Sounds like the Blackwater Gang," one said. "Same method bushwhacked the stage in the narrow pass, wore masks, but the driver recognized Rain's voice." Grace froze, her hands stilling on the papers. The Blackwater Gang back in the territory. She had almost allowed herself to believe they were gone for good, moved on to easier pickings elsewhere. "Anyone hurt?" the second man asked. Driver took a bullet in the shoulder. "Passenger got roughed up when he tried to keep his watch. No one killed, thank the Lord." Grace finished her work mechanically, her mind churning with this new information. She debated whether to mention it to Nathan and the Calloways. Would it only worry them needlessly? But if the gang was operating in the area again, everyone should be on their guard. She decided to tell them. The ride back to the ranch seemed longer than usual, with every shadow in the trees taking on sinister possibilities. By the time she arrived, Grace had worked herself into a state of nervous tension. Nathan noticed immediately when she entered the barn where he was repairing a harness. "What's wrong?" he asked, setting aside his work. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Grace related what she had overheard at the mill. Nathan's expression grew grim as he listened. "I'd heard whispers, but nothing confirmed," he said when she finished. "Bitter Creek isn't far, maybe 30 miles south. Do you think they'd come back here?" Grace asked, voicing her deepest fear. "To my land," Nathan considered this, his brow furrowed. "It's possible, but not likely. They got what they wanted from you, or rather, they convinced themselves there was nothing to get. They tend to move on rather than revisit old targets." His reasoning made sense, but it did little to ease the knot of anxiety in Grace's stomach. "What if they hear I'm rebuilding, that I survived their attack? Then we'll be ready for them," Nathan said firmly. "You won't be alone this time, Grace. The whole community will stand with you." The conviction in his voice was reassuring, but that night, Grace's dreams were haunted by flames and the cruel laughter of Samuel Rain. She awoke gasping, sheets tangled around her legs, the memory of smoke burning her nostrils. The news of the Blackwater Gang's return spread quickly through the territory. Marshal Thompson increased patrols, and homesteaders began traveling in groups for safety. But as March progressed without further incidents nearby, the immediate fear began to fade, replaced by a wary vigilance. Work on Grace's cabin began in early April, as soon as the ground had thawed enough to dig the foundation. True to his word, James Calloway arranged for Nathan to spend 2 days each week helping with the construction. Other neighbors pitched in as well, the Henleys from the east, the Petersons from across the valley, and several of the Calloway Ranch hands on their days off. Grace worked alongside them all, determined to contribute as much as possible to rebuilding her home. She learned to notch logs under Nathan's patient instruction, to mix mortar for the chimney, to split shingles for the roof. The work was exhausting but deeply satisfying, watching her new home take shape day by day. Nathan was a natural teacher, explaining each step of the process clearly and demonstrating techniques, without making Grace feel incompetent. She found herself watching him when he wasn't looking the way his strong hands worked the wood, the focus in his eyes when he was measuring, the easy way he directed the other workers without seeming bossy or overbearing. "You're good at this," she told him one afternoon as they took a break, sharing water from a canteen in the shade of a half-built wall. "Teaching, I mean." Nathan looked surprised at the compliment. "Am I? Never thought about it much." "You are," Grace insisted. "You explain things clearly and you're patient. You'd have made a good school teacher yourself." A small smile played at the corners of his mouth. "Maybe in another life. In this one, I'm content with teaching you how to build a proper cabin." As April turned to May, the cabin progressed rapidly. The walls rose log by log, the roof was framed and shingled, and the stone chimney grew steadily upward. Grace planted a garden beside the new structure, determined that this year's harvest would be better than the last. One evening, as the sun was setting over the mountains, Grace and Nathan stood back to admire the nearly completed cabin. The windows still needed glass and the interior required finishing, but the structure itself was sound larger than her previous home, with a covered porch and a loft for sleeping. "It's better than the old one," Grace said, a sense of wonder in her voice. "I never thought I'd say that, but it's true." Nathan nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "Built to last this time, that chimney won't fall in 100 years. Grace looked up at him, suddenly overwhelmed with gratitude. "I couldn't have done this without you, Nathan, not any of it." "You would have found a way," he said, his voice gentle. "You're the strongest woman I've ever known, Grace Zimmerman." The admiration in his eyes made her breath catch. They stood close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could count the laugh lines at their corners. Something magnetic seemed to draw them together, an invisible force that had been building for months. Nathan lifted his hand hesitantly and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was feather-light, but it sent a shiver down Grace's spine. "Grace," he said softly, "I've been wanting to tell you." A shout from down the trail interrupted whatever he had been about to say. They stepped apart quickly as one of the Calloway Ranch hands came riding up at a gallop. "Nathan," the young cowboy called, reining in his lathered horse. "You're needed back at the ranch. A section of fence is down in the north pasture, and half the herds wandered onto Peterson land." The moment broken, Nathan nodded briskly. "I'll come right away." He turned to Grace, regret in his eyes. "I have to go." "Of course," she said, trying to hide her disappointment. "The herd comes first." Nathan hesitated, looking as though he wanted to finish what he had started to say, but the ranch hand was waiting impatiently and duty called. With a last, lingering look, Nathan mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Grace standing alone before her half-finished home. The incident at the ranch kept Nathan busy for several days, dealing with the escaped cattle and repairing the damaged fence. When he returned to help with the cabin, there were always others around, neighbors lending a hand with the final details, Martha bringing food for the workers, James stopping by to check on the progress. The moment of intimacy by the cabin seemed to hang between them, unacknowledged but not forgotten. Grace found herself watching for opportunities to speak with Nathan alone, to discover what he had been about to say that evening. But the right moment never seemed to present itself. By late May, the cabin was nearly complete. The windows were glazed, the door hung on sturdy hinges, and the interior furnished with a mix of salvaged items and gifts from neighbors. It wasn't as fully equipped as her old home had been, but it was livable, a testament to community spirit and hard work. "You'll be able to move in next week," Martha observed as she helped Grace arrange the small kitchen. "Just in time for summer." Grace nodded, running her hand along the smooth wooden counter that Nathan had crafted. It's hard to believe it's really happening. There were times this winter when I thought I'd never have a home of my own again. Martha gave her a knowing look. You've done remarkably well, dear. Not just with the cabin, but with everything. You've made quite an impression on everyone. She paused, then added casually, especially Nathan. Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks. He's been very kind, everyone has. Kindness doesn't explain the way that man looks at you when he thinks no one's watching, Martha said with a smile. James and I have noticed. We think it's wonderful. Not knowing how to respond, Grace busied herself with arranging cups on a shelf. Nathan is important to me, she admitted finally, but my focus has been on rebuilding. As it should be, Martha agreed. But life is about more than just shelter and work, dear. Don't let fear keep you from happiness when it's standing right in front of you. The older woman's words stayed with Grace throughout the day and into the evening. As the sun set, she found herself walking alone around the perimeter of her new home, admiring how the golden light warmed the fresh-cut timber. The scent of pine resin still hung in the air, mingling with the earthy smell of the newly turned garden soil. This was hers, her land, her home, built with her own hands and the hands of people who cared for her. The Blackwater Gang had taken everything from her, but in doing so, they had inadvertently given her something precious. The knowledge that she wasn't truly alone, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention. Nathan rode into the clearing, his tall figure silhouetted against the setting sun. He dismounted with the easy grace of a man who had spent his life on horseback and secured his gelding to a hitching post by the garden fence. I thought I might find you here, he said, approaching with a slight smile. Admiring your handiwork, our handiwork, Grace corrected him. I was just thinking about how many hands went into building this place. Nathan nodded, looking up at the cabin. It turned out well, solid. A home to be proud of. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching as the shadows lengthened across the clearing. A cool evening breeze stirred Grace's hair, carrying with it the scent of wild roses blooming somewhere nearby. Martha says I can move in next week, Grace said finally. Everything's nearly ready. That's good, Nathan replied, though there was an odd note in his voice that Grace couldn't quite identify. You'll be glad to have your own space again. I will, she agreed, though I'll miss the Callaways. And she hesitated, then finished softly, I'll miss seeing you every day. Nathan turned to face her fully, his expression serious. Grace, about what I was going to say the other evening, before we were interrupted, a sudden sharp crack split the air, followed immediately by the unmistakable sound of a bullet striking wood. Grace felt something whiz past her ear, and then Nathan was tackling her to the ground, covering her body with his own as more shots rang out. Stay down, he ordered, his voice tight with urgency. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs as she pressed her face into the cool earth. The shooting stopped as abruptly as it had begun, replaced by the sound of horses approaching at a gallop. Well, well, called a familiar voice that made Grace's blood run cold. Look who's rebuilding, if it isn't the gold-hoarding Zimmerman girl, Samuel Rain. The Blackwater Gang had returned. Nathan shifted slightly, keeping his body between Grace and the approaching riders. Stay behind me, he murmured. When I tell you to run, head for the trees to the west. Don't look back. I'm not leaving you, Grace whispered fiercely. You have to, Nathan insisted. I'll keep them busy. Before Grace could argue further, the riders circled into view 6 men, just as before, with Samuel Rain at their head. They reined in their horses a short distance away, spread out in a loose semicircle that cut off easy escape to the trail. Stand up slow, Rain called. Both of you. Hands where we can see them. Nathan rose cautiously, keeping Grace behind him. We don't want trouble, he said, his voice steady despite the danger. There's nothing of value here, Rain laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. That's what the lady claimed last time. But look at this, a brand new cabin built with good timber. Seems like she found some money somewhere after all. Neighbors helped, Nathan replied. That's how things work out here. One of the other outlaws spat on the ground. Touching, but we didn't come for a lesson in frontier cooperation. What do you want? Grace asked, stepping out from behind Nathan despite his attempt to keep her shielded. Rain's eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his black hat. "We didn't finish our business last time, Miss Zimmerman. You ran before we could have a proper conversation about your father's gold." "There is no gold," Grace said, struggling to keep her voice level. "There never was, it was just a story." "See, I don't believe that," Rain replied, dismounting and handing his reins to the man beside him. "A man works his whole life, then dies and leaves nothing. Doesn't make sense." He took a step toward them, his hand resting casually on the revolver at his hip. "So we're going to have that conversation now." Nathan tensed beside Grace. She could feel his readiness like a coiled spring. He had no weapon, his rifle was in its scabbard on his saddle, out of reach. "The lady told you the truth," Nathan said. "There's nothing to find, you're wasting your time." Rain's gaze shifted to him, assessing. "And who might you be, the new man in her life?" His mouth twisted in a cruel smile. "Hope you didn't invest too much in this relationship." "It might be short-lived." Grace felt fear course through her, not for herself but for Nathan. "He's just a neighbor helping with the building," she said quickly. "He has nothing to do with any of this." "Too late for that," Rain said. "He's involved now." He gestured to two of his men. "Search the cabin. Tear up the floorboards if you have to." The outlaws dismounted and headed for the cabin. Grace watched helplessly as they entered her newly built home, knowing they would destroy it in their search for non-existent treasure. "You're making a mistake," Nathan said, his voice low and dangerous. "The marshal knows the Blackwater Gang is back in the territory. There's a posse organized, just waiting for word of your location." Rain seemed unimpressed. "Then we'd better be quick about our business, hadn't we?" He drew his revolver, pointing it casually in their direction. "Now, Miss Zimmerman, I'm losing patience. Where is the gold?" Grace felt desperation rise within her. "I've told you there is no gold. My father was a farmer, not a miner or a bank robber. He left me land and a cabin, nothing more." "Liar," Rain snarled, his composure cracking. "Jackson saw your father in White Rock 6 years ago paying for supplies with gold dust. Where did a farmer get gold dust?" Understanding dawned on Grace. "That was from a pocket watch, an old family heirloom. He sold it when the crops failed 1 year." "That's all it was." Doubt flickered across Rain's face, quickly replaced by anger. "You expect me to believe he was interrupted by one of his men emerging from the cabin?" "Nothing in there, boss. No hiding places, no loose boards, nothing." Rain's jaw tightened. "Check the garden, the well." She could have buried it anywhere. As the outlaws began tearing up her newly planted garden, Grace felt a mixture of despair and anger. Everything she had worked to rebuild was being destroyed all over again. Nathan leaned closer to her, speaking in a barely audible whisper. "When I move, run for my horse. He's trained to head back to Calloway's if you give him his head. Don't argue." Before Grace could respond, a commotion from the direction of the well caught everyone's attention. One of the outlaws had removed the wooden cover and was peering inside. "There's something down there," he called. "Looks like a box or something, caught on a ledge." Rain's expression turned triumphant. "Bring it up." The outlaw began lowering a rope into the well. Everyone's attention was focused on the potential discovery, everyone except Nathan, who was tense like a cat ready to pounce. "Now," he breathed, and then he was moving, charging straight at Rain with reckless courage. Grace hesitated only a fraction of a second before racing toward Nathan's horse. Behind her, she heard shouts, a gunshot, the sound of men fighting. She reached Scout and untied him with trembling hands, then pulled herself into the saddle. She couldn't leave Nathan. Turning the horse, she saw him grappling with Rain, while the other outlaws were rushing to their leader's aid. Nathan had managed to knock Rain's gun away, but he was outnumbered 5-1, making a split-second decision. Grace urged Scout forward, charging directly at the group of outlaws. The sudden attack from an unexpected direction caused them to scatter. She leaned down from the saddle as she passed Nathan, extending her arm. Nathan, he saw her, understood instantly and grabbed her arm. With a strength born of desperation, Grace helped pull him up behind her as Scout galloped past. Nathan settled behind her, his arms encircling her waist as he took the reins. "Ride," he shouted, spurring Scout toward the western trail. Bullets whistled past them as the outlaws recovered and opened fire. Scout responded to Nathan's urging, stretching out into a full gallop that ate up the ground. Behind them, the Blackwater Gang scrambled for their horses. "They'll catch us on the trail," Grace shouted over the thunder of hooves. "Scout can't outrun 6 horses with 2 riders." "Not taking the trail," Nathan called back, steering the horse into the dense forest that bordered the western edge of Grace's property. The trees closed around them, forcing Scout to slow to a more careful pace. The undergrowth was thick, making pursuit difficult for riders who didn't know the terrain. Nathan navigated with surprising confidence, following what appeared to be a game trail that wound deeper into the woods. "Where are we going?" Grace asked, clinging to the saddle horn as branches whipped past them. "There's an old trapper's cabin about 3 miles from here," Nathan replied, his breath warm against her ear. "We can hide there until it's safe." They could hear the outlaws crashing through the forest behind them, but the sounds grew fainter as Nathan's knowledge of the land gave them an advantage. Scout picked his way carefully down a steep embankment and splashed across a shallow creek, a move that would help obscure their trail. By the time they reached the trapper's cabin, the sun had set completely, leaving them in the deep blue of twilight. The cabin was little more than a one-room shack, weathered and listing slightly to one side, but it offered shelter and concealment. Nathan dismounted quickly, then helped Grace down. "Stay with Scout," he instructed, drawing a knife from his boot, the only weapon he had. "I'll check inside." The cabin was empty save for some ancient furs too rotted to be of use and a crude stone fireplace. Nathan returned to Grace and led Scout around to the back, where a lean-to provided some shelter for the horse. "We should be safe here for the night," he said, helping Grace inside the cabin. "The Blackwater Gang doesn't know these woods like I do." In the growing darkness, Grace could barely make out Nathan's features. "You're hurt," she said suddenly, noticing how he favored his left side. "It's nothing," he dismissed. "Caught a fist in the ribs during the scuffle." Grace wasn't convinced, but there was little she could do about it in their current circumstances. The cabin was cold and damp, with gaps between the logs that let in the night air. Without a fire, which would be too risky with the outlaws still searching, it promised to be an uncomfortable night. "I'm sorry," she said softly as they settled on the dirt floor, backs against the wall. "I've brought nothing but trouble into your life." Nathan's laugh was barely audible in the darkness. "That's not how I see it. No, what other way is there to see it? Your helping me rebuild has now put your life in danger." "Grace," Nathan said, his voice gentle but firm, "meeting you has been the best thing that's happened to me in years, even with outlaws shooting at us." The simple sincerity in his voice made Grace's breath catch. She was acutely aware of him beside her, their shoulders touching in the small space. "What were you going to tell me?" she asked. "Earlier, before the shooting started." Nathan was silent for so long that Grace thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "I was going to tell you that I've fallen in love with you." The words hung in the darkness between them, honest and unadorned. Grace's heart seemed to stutter, then race ahead. "I've watched you rebuild your life from ashes," Nathan continued when she didn't immediately respond. "Seen your courage, your determination, your kindness. How could I not love you?" Grace turned toward him, wishing she could see his face clearly. "I thought perhaps, but I was afraid to hope." "Afraid?" Nathan asked, genuine confusion in his voice. "I've lost so much," Grace explained, the words coming easier in the concealing darkness. "My mother, my father, my home. I was afraid to love someone, to risk losing again." Nathan's hand found hers in the dark, his calloused fingers entwining with hers. "I understand fear, Grace, but I've learned that fear makes a poor compass for life's journey." Grace leaned her head against his shoulder, taking comfort in his solid presence. "I think I've loved you since you rode through the flames to find me," she admitted. "But I didn't recognize it until later, until I saw the care you took with rebuilding my home, the way you taught me without making me feel less, the respect you showed for my independence even while offering help." Nathan's arm slipped around her shoulders, drawing her closer. "So where does that leave us?" he asked, a smile evident in his voice despite the danger of their situation. "In hiding from outlaws in a dilapidated trapper's cabin," Grace replied with a soft laugh. But together. And I find I prefer that to being safe and alone. They talked through much of the night, sharing hopes and plans for the future in hushed voices, alert for any sound that might indicate the Blackwater Gang had found their hiding place. But the forest remained quiet except for the normal sounds of night creatures. As dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Nathan carefully checked outside. There was no sign of pursuit, but caution dictated they remain hidden for a while longer. "We need to get word to the Calloways and the marshal," Nathan said as he rejoined Grace inside the cabin. "The gang will likely go back to your cabin, maybe even burn it again out of spite." Grace felt a pang at the thought of losing her newly built home, but she pushed it aside. "The cabin can be rebuilt, lives can't be replaced." Nathan's expression softened as he looked at her. "You continue to amaze me, Grace Zimmerman." They decided to wait until full daylight before attempting the journey back to the Calloway ranch. When the sun was well above the horizon, they mounted Scout and set off, taking a circuitous route that avoided Grace's property and the main trails. Their caution proved unnecessary. Halfway to the Calloways, they encountered a group of riders that turned out to be Marshal Thompson and a posse, including James Calloway and several of his ranch hands. "Nathan, Miss Zimmerman," James called out in relief when he spotted them. "Thank the Lord you're safe." The marshal pulled up alongside them, his weathered face grave. "We got word the Blackwater Gang was spotted near your property, Miss Zimmerman. Mrs. Calloway was worried when Nathan didn't return last night." "They were there," Nathan confirmed. "6 of them, including Rain. They're still looking for gold that doesn't exist." "Did they damage the new cabin?" Grace asked. "They did worse than that, I'm afraid," the marshal replied, his expression somber. "They burned it to the ground when they couldn't find what they were looking for." Grace closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the blow. Everything gone. Again. The garden trampled, the weeks of work destroyed, the new beginning turned to ashes just like the old one. "Are you all right?" Nathan asked quietly, his hand finding hers. Grace took a deep breath and opened her eyes. "Yes," she said, and was surprised to find it was true. "It's just a building. What matters is that we're both alive." The marshal was watching them with shrewd eyes. "The gang won't get far," he promised. "We've got passes out from here to Helena. Every pass is being watched." "I want to help," Nathan said firmly. "I owe them for what they did to Grace's home." Marshal Thompson nodded. "We could use another good man, but first, let's get Miss Zimmerman safely to the Calloway ranch." The group rode together to the ranch, where Martha was waiting anxiously on the porch. She rushed to embrace Grace as soon as she dismounted. "My dear girl," when Nathan didn't come home and then James heard about the Blackwater Gang being in the area. "We feared the worst." "We're fine," Grace assured her, though the words felt hollow. She was alive and unhurt, yes, but the loss of her home again was a wound that would take time to heal. Inside, over hot coffee and a hastily prepared meal, Nathan and Grace recounted their encounter with the Outlaws and their night in the trapper's cabin. Martha clucked sympathetically at the news about the cabin, while James and the marshal discussed strategy for capturing the Blackwater Gang. "I'll ride with the posse," Nathan announced when the plans were settled. "They need to be brought to justice before they destroy any more lives." Grace wanted to protest, to beg him not to put himself in danger, but she held her tongue. This was who Nathan was, a man who stood against injustice, who protected others. It was part of why she loved him. "Be careful," was all she said when the men prepared to leave. "Come back safely." Nathan drew her aside for a moment of privacy in the Calloway's kitchen garden. "I will," he promised. "And when I return, we'll talk about the future, our future." Grace nodded, blinking back tears. "I'll be here." The kiss they shared was brief but full of promise, a pledge more binding than words could express. Then Nathan was mounting Scout and riding away with the posse, leaving Grace to wait and worry. The next 3 days were among the longest of Grace's life. She kept busy helping Martha with household tasks, but her thoughts constantly strayed to Nathan and the danger he faced. The Blackwater Gang was cornered and desperate, making them more dangerous than ever. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, a rider appeared on the horizon, galloping hard toward the ranch. Grace was hanging laundry in the yard when she spotted him, and her heart seemed to freeze in her chest. A lone rider could mean anything: victory or tragedy. She dropped the wet sheet she had been about to hang and ran toward the approaching horseman. As he drew nearer, she recognized the marshal, his expression unreadable beneath his hat brim. "Marshal Thompson," she called as he reined in his horse. "What news?" The marshal dismounted slowly, and Grace's dread deepened at his deliberate movements. But when he removed his hat, there was a tired smile on his face. "It's over, Miss Zimmerman. We caught the Blackwater Gang trying to cross into Idaho territory. There was a fight. Samuel Rain won't trouble anyone again." Relief flooded through Grace. "And the others, the posse, is Nathan Irwin took a bullet in the shoulder," the marshal said, and Grace felt the world tilt beneath her. "But the doc says he'll make a full recovery. He's at the doctor's office in White Rock now. Asked me to tell you not to worry." Grace barely heard the rest of what the marshal had to say. Nathan was alive, injured but alive. Nothing else mattered. "Can you take me to White Rock?" she asked, cutting through whatever the marshal had been saying about the disposition of the other gang members. "Please, I need to see him." Martha, who had joined them in the yard, placed a gentle hand on Grace's arm. "James will take you in the wagon as soon as he gets back from the south pasture. It would be too hard on Nathan if you tried to ride double with the marshal." Reluctantly, Grace agreed to wait. The hours until James returned seemed to stretch endlessly, but finally they were on their way to White Rock, the wagon bouncing over the rutted trail faster than was entirely safe. The doctor's office was a small white building on the main street of town. Grace hardly waited for the wagon to stop before jumping down and rushing inside. The doctor's wife, who served as his assistant, looked up from her desk with a knowing smile. "You must be Miss Zimmerman," she said. "He's been asking for you, second door on the left." Grace knocked softly, then entered at the sound of a familiar voice calling, "Come in." Nathan was sitting up in a narrow bed, his left shoulder and upper chest wrapped in white bandages. He looked pale but alert, his face brightening when he saw her. "Grace," he said, his voice warm with welcome. "I told the marshal not to worry you." "Not worry me," Grace repeated, moving to his bedside and taking his hand. "You were shot." Nathan's smile was slightly chagrined. "Just a scratch." "Men always say that," Grace replied, blinking back tears of relief. "Even when they're bleeding half to death." "I'm hardly dying," Nathan assured her, squeezing her hand. "Doc says I'll be up and about in a week, though it'll be a while before I'm lifting logs again." Grace sat carefully on the edge of the bed, mindful of his injury. "I don't care about logs or cabins right now. I care about you." Nathan's expression grew serious. "The marshal told you about Rain." Grace nodded. "He said it's over, that the gang won't trouble anyone again." "Rain and 2 others are dead," Nathan confirmed solemnly. "The rest will hang or spend their lives in prison. It won't bring back your home, but at least there's justice." "I've been thinking about that," Grace said slowly. "About my home." She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I'm not sure I want to rebuild on that same spot again. Too many bad memories now." Nathan studied her face, understanding in his eyes. "Where then?" "I was thinking of selling the land," Grace continued, "using the money to start fresh somewhere else, somewhere without ghosts." "That makes sense," Nathan agreed, though there was a hint of something like disappointment in his voice. "Any idea where you might go?" Grace smiled, suddenly shy despite everything they had shared. "That depends on you." "On me?" Nathan looked genuinely puzzled. "You mentioned once that you dreamed of having your own piece of land someday. Something modest enough for a small herd, a garden." Understanding dawned in Nathan's eyes, followed by a hope so bright it transformed his face. "Grace, are you saying?" "I'm saying that home isn't a place," Grace said softly. "It's people. It's where you're loved and understood, and for me, that's wherever you are." Nathan reached up with his good arm, his hand gently cupping her cheek. "Are you proposing to me, Grace Zimmerman?" Grace laughed, leaning into his touch. "I suppose I am. Is that terribly forward of me?" "Terribly," Nathan agreed with a grin. "But then, you've never been one to follow the usual path. It's one of the things I love about you." "Is that a yes?" Grace asked, her heart hammering in her chest. "It's a yes," Nathan confirmed, Though I feel I should be the one asking you, I've been carrying this around for weeks, waiting for the right moment." He reached under his pillow and produced a small velvet pouch. It was my mother's. Grace opened the pouch with trembling fingers. Inside was a simple gold band with a small pearl set in the center, modest but beautiful. "Nathan," she breathed, "it's perfect." "Like you," he said, taking the ring and sliding it onto her finger. It fit as though it had been made for her. "I love you, Grace. I want to build a life with you, a home, a family, a future." "I love you too," Grace replied, leaning forward to kiss him gently, mindful of his injury. "And I can't imagine a better partner to face that future with." 2 months later, on a warm July afternoon, Grace Zimmerman became Grace Irwin in a simple ceremony at the Cowboy Ranch. Martha had insisted on hosting the wedding, treating Grace like the daughter she had never had as she helped with preparations. The entire community turned out for the occasion: the Henleys, the Petersons, the mill owner and his wife, the doctor and his family, and of course, Marshall Thompson, who had become a good friend during the aftermath of the Blackwater Gang's capture. Grace wore a new dress of soft blue, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Nathan, fully recovered from his wound, looked handsome and slightly nervous in a new suit that Martha had insisted on buying for him. "Never seen a man more in love," James Calloway commented to his wife as they watched the couple exchange vows beneath an arch of roses in the ranch yard. Nor a woman, for that matter. After the ceremony and the celebration that followed, Nathan drove Grace in a new wagon, a wedding gift from the community, to their new home. They had purchased a small property about 10 miles from the Calloway Ranch, with good water and a sturdy cabin that needed only minor repairs. The land was perfect for the small horse breeding operation Nathan hoped to establish, with plenty of room for the garden Grace had already started. As they approached the cabin, now decorated with garlands of flowers thanks to Martha's secret advance preparation, Nathan drew the wagon to a halt. Before Grace could descend, he came around and lifted her in his arms. "Nathan," she laughed, wrapping her arms around his neck, "your shoulder is completely healed," he assured her. "And I intend to carry my wife across the threshold properly." He did just that, setting her gently on her feet in the main room of what was now their home. The cabin was simple but comfortable, filled with a mixture of new furnishings and items salvaged or gifted by neighbors. "Welcome home, Mrs. Irwin," Nathan said softly, drawing her into his arms. Grace looked around at the cabin, at the hearth where they would share meals and stories, at the windows that let in the golden afternoon light, at the sturdy walls that would shelter them through Montana's harsh winters. "It feels right," she said, leaning her head against his chest. "Like this is where we were always meant to be," Nathan's arms tightened around her. "From the moment I rode through the flames and found you, I think we were heading here, though I admit I took a rather roundabout trail." Grace smiled up at him. "The path doesn't matter as much as the destination," she said. "And this," she gestured to the cabin, to their entwined hands, to the future stretching out before them, "this was worth every step of the journey." As the sun began to set over the mountains, casting long golden rays through the cabin windows, Nathan kissed his bride. Outside, their horses grazed contentedly in the pasture, and the garden waited for tomorrow's tending. Inside, a new life had begun, not built on the ashes of the past, but on the foundation of a love that had been forged in fire and proven in adversity. For Grace and Nathan Irwin, the best chapters of their story were just beginning to unfold. Epilogue: 5 years later, Grace stood on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching as Nathan taught their 4-year-old son Thomas how to brush a new foal. The child's delighted laughter carried across the yard, mingling with the sounds of the thriving ranch they had built together. The Irwin Horse Ranch had developed a reputation throughout the territory for its quality stock. Nathan's knowledge of horseflesh, combined with Grace's head for business, had created a successful enterprise that allowed them to live comfortably. The original cabin had been expanded to accommodate their growing family. Thomas had been joined by 2-year-old Sarah, and Grace's gently rounded belly promised another addition in the coming winter. Life wasn't perfect. Montana territory still presented challenges in the form of harsh winters, occasional drought, and the everyday struggles of frontier life. But it was a good life, rich with love and purpose. Grace smiled as Nathan lifted Thomas onto his shoulders, the boy squealing with delight as they headed back toward the house. Sarah, hearing her brother's laughter, toddled out from where she had been playing nearby and raised her arms to her father. "And how are my girls?" Nathan asked as he approached, shifting Thomas to one shoulder so he could scoop up Sarah with his free arm. "We're fine," Grace replied, resting a hand on her belly. "Your son has been practicing his kicking today." "Another boy, is it?" Nathan asked with a grin. They had a running debate about whether this child would be a boy or a girl. Mother's intuition, Grace insisted, though in truth she had no idea. She was simply happy to have another child to love. The family went inside together as the sun began to set, gathering around the table for the evening meal. As Grace looked at the faces of her husband and children in the warm lamplight, she felt a deep contentment that still sometimes surprised her. From the ashes of tragedy, she had found a happiness greater than she had ever imagined possible. Later, with the children asleep and the house quiet, Grace and Nathan sat together on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the vast Montana sky. Nathan's arm was around her shoulders, his hand absently caressing her arm in a gesture that had become as familiar as breathing. "I got a letter from Martha today," Grace said. "The Callaways are planning a visit next month. They want to see the new foals." "And the children," Nathan added with a smile. "Martha spoils them terribly." "She has a grandmother's privilege," Grace replied, "and I don't mind. She and James have been like family to us." They fell into a comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of their ranch, a horse nickering softly in the barn, the distant howl of a coyote, the whisper of wind through the pine trees that surrounded their home. "You ever think about it?" Nathan asked after a while. "About that night?" "About what might have happened if I hadn't come along when I did," Grace considered the question, which Nathan had never asked before in quite this way. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but not with fear anymore. It's like a story that happened to someone else, sad but distant." Nathan nodded, understanding. "I think that's how healing works. The memories don't disappear, but they lose their power to hurt us." Grace turned her face up to his, studying the features she had come to know as well as her own, the lines at the corners of his eyes that deepened when he smiled, the small scar on his chin from a childhood accident, the steadfastness in his gaze that had been her anchor through good times and bad. "You rode through flames to find me," she said softly, echoing words she had spoken to him years before. "And every day since then, you've helped me build something better than what was lost." Nathan leaned down to kiss her, a gesture still filled with tenderness and passion after 5 years of marriage. "I'd do it all again," he murmured against her lips. "Every bit of it." As the stars wheeled overhead and their children slept safely within the walls they had built together, Grace and Nathan Irwin held each other close, grateful for the fire that had brought them together and the love that had risen from the ashes.